The smoke of war still hung heavy over Europe, and amidst the thunder of bombs and cries of soldiers, a different kind of courage stepped forward. They carried no weapons, wore no uniforms, and yet walked straight into chaos. These were the women who dared to write when others turned away, who faced the front lines not with bullets but with words. Their typewriters clattered like gunfire, their cameras captured the truth no one wished to see. In a world built for men, they proved that truth itself could be the bravest weapon of all. By the late summer of 1939, Europe trembled on the edge of chaos. Armies gathered, diplomats whispered, and newspapers buzzed with rumors of invasion. Inside the smoky press rooms of London, typewriters clattered endlessly as men in dark suits debated the coming storm. There were few women in those rooms, and fewer still who dared to imagine themselves at the front lines of war. The rules were clear: the battlefield was no place for women. Yet there were a few who refused to listen. Among them was a young British reporter named Clare Hollingworth, barely 27, determined, sharp-eyed, and relentless in her pursuit of the truth. In August of that year, she borrowed a car, drove across the Polish border, and saw something that would change history. Through the windscreen, stretching across the horizon, she saw hundreds of German tanks lined up in eerie silence, waiting for the order to invade. She rushed back to her hotel, grabbed the phone, and called her editor in London. Her voice shook as she said, "I saw the tanks. Hundreds of them." That was the beginning. The world didn't believe her at first, but within days, the German army rolled into Poland, and her dispatch became the first eyewitness report of the Second World War. While Hollingworth was uncovering the storm's beginning, across the Atlantic, another woman prepared for her own battle, not with soldiers, but with bureaucracy and disbelief. Martha Gellhorn, already an accomplished writer and war correspondent, had the heart of a fighter. She had seen the rise of fascism in Spain and written fearlessly about its horrors. Yet when the United States entered the war, military officials refused to grant her credentials to cover it. "Women don't belong in war zones," one officer told her flatly. But Martha didn't wait for permission. With quiet defiance, she found her own way to the front, often traveling as a civilian, blending among nurses and aid workers, notebook hidden in her coat. When her husband, Ernest Hemingway, was sent to cover D-Day with official papers, Gellhorn was told to stay behind. Instead, she disguised herself as a stretcher-bearer and smuggled herself onto a hospital ship crossing the Channel. On June 6, 1944, as shells exploded and men screamed across the beaches of Normandy, Martha Gellhorn stepped into history, not as a soldier or a nurse, but as a witness to truth. Meanwhile, another woman prepared her camera rather than a pen. Lee Miller, once a fashion model for Vogue, had turned her lens from beauty to brutality. War fascinated her, not its glory, but its cost. She photographed bombed cities, wounded soldiers, and the haunted eyes of civilians who had lost everything. To many, it was unthinkable that a woman who once graced Parisian runways would crawl through mud and rubble to capture the war's rawest moments, yet Lee did just that. Her work would later reveal the depths of Nazi atrocities, but in these early years she, too, was fighting to be taken seriously. Men scoffed at the idea of a woman with a camera standing amid falling shells. "Go home," they told her. "This isn't your world." But Miller, Gellhorn, and Hollingworth shared something the men did not understand, a conviction that truth had no gender. As Europe descended into darkness, they moved closer to the fire, their pens and lenses trained on the world's unfolding madness. They wrote not to glorify battle, but to show what war did to the human soul. Every article they sent home carried more than just facts, it carried defiance. Their presence alone was a quiet revolution. In a time when armies saw them as outsiders, and editors treated them as novelties, they proved that courage could wear lipstick, that truth could have a woman's voice, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do in war was simply to bear witness. When the war engulfed Europe, cameras became as vital as rifles, and for a handful of fearless women, the lens became their weapon. They traveled not for glory, not for medals, but for truth, moving beside soldiers through mud, fire, and fear, capturing moments that history might otherwise forget. Most of them were not even supposed to be there. The military bureaucracy of the 1940s did not know what to do with women who wanted to crawl into trenches instead of sitting in offices. So they went anyway. They forged press passes, talked their way past checkpoints, or simply followed the sound of artillery until they reached the front. Among them was Lee Miller, a woman who had once stood under the soft lights of Paris fashion studios, her face gracing the pages of Vogue. But when the bombs fell, she traded silk dresses for steel helmets. She followed the Allied troops from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the gates of hell, to the Dachau concentration camp, where her camera would reveal to the world what words could barely describe. On the morning of D-Day, Miller landed not far behind the first waves of soldiers. The air was thick with smoke and sea spray, and around her men fell into the sand. She did not flinch. She lifted her camera, pressed a shutter, and froze a fragment of chaos, a moment no one else dared to capture. Her photographs would later be published worldwide, shattering illusions of distant heroism and showing the brutal intimacy of war. Every image was a rebellion against silence. Far above her, another woman pointed her lens toward the clouds. Margaret Burke-White, America's first female war photographer allowed to fly combat missions, climbed inside the belly of bombers over Italy and Germany. As anti-aircraft shells burst around her plane, she hung from open hatches, camera in hand, recording the grim ballet of destruction. Her courage astonished even the soldiers she accompanied. "She's mad," one pilot joked. But when they saw her photographs, the black smoke rising over bombed cities, the faces of the crew lit by flares, they realized madness looked a lot like courage. Her photos were printed in Life magazine, bringing the front lines into living rooms across America. Ordinary people saw, for the first time, what their sons faced thousands of miles away. These women had no armor, no protection beyond their conviction. They slept in bombed-out buildings, ate soldiers' rations, and wrote their dispatches by candlelight amid the constant thunder of war. Many male officers dismissed them, some mocked them, and a few even tried to send them home. "You're too delicate for this," they'd sneer. But when the newspapers arrived, when the photographs filled the front pages and millions of readers felt the chill of those images, the laughter stopped. Because through their eyes, the world saw the war unfiltered. They didn't just photograph battles, they documented endurance. The soldier cradling his wounded friend, the nurse weeping in a field hospital, the children staring through barbed wire. Their cameras did not glorify war, they exposed it. To capture a single picture, they risked not only their lives but their place in history, knowing they might be forgotten once peace returned. Yet that didn't matter. What mattered was the truth inside the frame. Proof that courage could come in high heels and muddy boots, that even in a man's war, the sharpest weapon might just be a woman's eye behind a lens. By the spring of 1945, the war was crawling toward its bitter end, but for the women who had fought to tell its story, the real battle had just begun. Lee Miller stepped off a transport truck near Munich, her camera heavy, her boots caked in mud, and her face drawn with exhaustion. She had seen too much already, the bombed cities, the dead in ditches. But what waited beyond the barbed wire of Dachau was something the human mind wasn't meant to contain. The stench hit first, thick and choking, the unmistakable smell of death and burning flesh. Then the silence, broken only by the faint shuffle of survivors who could barely stand. Miller raised her camera, hands trembling. Every click of the shutter was a scream, every frame a confrontation with evil. She didn't speak, the lens did. Each photo she took, rows of bodies, hollow eyes, the monstrous machinery of the camp, would later shake the conscience of the world. She wasn't supposed to be there. Women weren't supposed to see this. But she had come anyway, without permission, because someone had to tell the truth. Martha Gellhorn was never far behind. She had followed the refugee columns across Europe, writing dispatches that peeled away the patriotic gloss of victory and revealed the cost written on human faces. Her reports described children clinging to dead mothers, the haunted eyes of prisoners liberated from camps, and soldiers whose minds had broken long before the guns went silent. The censors tried to stop her, the army barred her from the front, but Gellhorn didn't care. When the Allies prepared for D-Day, she stowed away on a hospital ship, hiding in a bathroom until the invasion began. She waded ashore with the medics, under fire, pen and notebook in hand, writing what she saw not as a hero's triumph but as a human catastrophe. She was the only woman to land at Normandy that day, and she did it without orders, without applause, only conviction. Lee Miller, meanwhile, marched deeper into Germany with the 45th Infantry Division. In April, she entered Munich, and in a surreal twist of fate, found herself in Hitler's apartment. Covered in filth from Dachau, she ran a bath, dropped her uniform to the floor, and washed the ashes of the camps from her skin in the dictator's tub. Her war photographer friend David Sherman captured the moment. A quiet act of defiance, a woman reclaiming her humanity in the home of the man who had tried to erase it. The photograph would become one of the most haunting images of the war, not for its nudity or shock, but for what it symbolized, cleansing horror with defiance. Across the front, women correspondents wrote of things the world didn't want to hear. They described the broken cities of Europe, where survivors searched for names on scraps of paper nailed to walls. They chronicled the empty stares of soldiers who had survived but were lost forever inside themselves. They wrote about the cost of conquest and the futility of hatred. These weren't sanitized dispatches filled with numbers and maps. They were raw, emotional testaments to the suffering of ordinary people. When Gellhorn's reports reached home, readers were shaken. Her words stripped war of its glory. They made it human, fragile, unbearable. "I saw too much," she later said, "and I will carry it with me forever." Lee Miller's photographs were equally haunting. Her camera had seen what others turned away from: the ovens, the piles of shoes, the faces of survivors who no longer believed in salvation. She said little about it afterward. Perhaps words were no longer enough. Both women carried scars the world couldn't see. They had stepped into the abyss and returned, but a part of them had been left behind in the ruins of Europe. For years after the war, their work was downplayed, sometimes dismissed, as if courage could only come in uniform and from a man. Yet their photographs and words would outlast all the propaganda. They bore witness when it mattered most. They transformed journalism into a weapon sharper than any rifle, a mirror that forced humanity to confront itself. In the end, their bravery wasn't just in facing bullets or bombs, but in refusing to look away. When the guns finally fell silent and Europe's battlefields turned to dust, the women who had risked everything to tell the world the truth found themselves standing on unfamiliar ground, a peace they had dreamed of, yet could not find within. For years they had lived on adrenaline, purpose, and the deafening rhythm of war. Now, the silence was unbearable. Lee Miller, once a dazzling model and daring photojournalist, returned to her home in England with eyes that had seen too much. The woman who had photographed Hitler's bathtub could no longer bear to pick up her camera. Her son later recalled how she locked her wartime negatives in a trunk, never speaking of them again. The weight of what she witnessed at Dachau and Buchenwald became an invisible scar, etched deeper than any bullet wound. Martha Gellhorn, too, faced her own ghosts. She had reported from the beaches of Normandy, from the wreckage of concentration camps, from the ruins of cities where even the air felt haunted, yet when she returned, the world remembered her only as Hemingway's wife. She refused that identity, writing bitterly that women were not meant to be heroes. But she was one, even if history forgot to say so. Clare Hollingworth, who had sounded the alarm of World War II with her story of German tanks crossing into Poland, spent the rest of her life chasing wars, North Africa, the Middle East, Vietnam, unable to stop searching for the truth that had defined her youth. It was as if the front lines had become her home, the only place where she felt seen. Their war was not just against fascism, it was against invisibility. Editors often stripped their names from bylines, claiming women couldn't handle the truth of war. Even their victories were borrowed. Photographs credited to male editors, stories rewritten to sound more authoritative. In smoky press rooms and government briefings, they were ghosts, present but unacknowledged. And yet they kept writing, kept fighting the quiet war of memory. Margaret Bourke-White, whose lens had captured the fury of battle and the silent grief of survivors, suffered from Parkinson's later in life. She could no longer hold her camera steady, but her images remained eternal: steel birds in flight, faces in rubble, the dignity of endurance. Each of them carried trauma that no metal could mend. Their dreams were filled with the cries of refugees, the stench of burning tanks, the echoes of the dead. They had chronicled humanity's darkest hour, only to be forgotten by the light of peace. When awards and honors were distributed, their names were seldom mentioned. History preferred its heroes in uniform, not behind typewriters or cameras. But time, as it does, began to remember. Decades later, dusty archives revealed their dispatches, raw and trembling with truth. New generations of journalists, women who braved Sarajevo, Baghdad, Kabul, began to cite them as pioneers. Documentaries unearthed their letters. Museums displayed their photographs. The world finally began to understand that their courage had been a different kind of weapon, one that pierced silence instead of armor. Yet for many, recognition came too late. Gellhorn died in 1998, nearly blind but unbroken, her ashes scattered in the sea she once crossed to reach Normandy. Lee Miller's son discovered her hidden negatives only after her death, revealing to the world the forgotten brilliance she had buried. Clare Hollingworth lived to 105, her sharp eyes fading but her memory of that first day of war undimmed. They had seen horror, but also humanity. They had captured not just war, but the cost of truth. Theirs was a sacrifice that did not end when the war did, because some battles continue in silence, long after the guns go quiet. And so, in their fading years, as the world moved on to new conflicts and new heroes, these women carried within them the price of remembrance, proof that courage is not always decorated, and that sometimes the bravest act is to keep telling the story, even when no one is listening. Decades after the guns of World War II fell silent, the echoes of those who dared to tell its truth still resonate across every newsroom, battlefield, and camera lens. The women who once fought for a byline now stand as giants whose courage redefined journalism itself. They had no medals, no parades, and few headlines celebrating them, but their legacy endures in every war correspondent who dares to step into chaos with only words and truth as armor. Martha Gellhorn's dispatches remain required reading for those who wish to understand not just the cost of war, but the resilience of the human spirit. Her belief that war happens to people, one by one, transformed how conflict was written about forever. She refused to glorify it, refused to turn death into statistics. Through her eyes, readers saw the faces behind history, the refugees, the wounded, the forgotten. When she later covered Vietnam and the Arab-Israeli conflict, even in her 70s, she carried the same restless conviction that silence was complicity. Lee Miller's photographs, once too shocking for public consumption, are now preserved in museums as proof of what human cruelty and courage can look like. Her image of herself bathing in Hitler's tub remains one of the most powerful visual metaphors in modern history, the triumph of truth and survival over tyranny. She would spend the rest of her life haunted by what she had seen, yet unwilling to erase it. "I keep it with me," she once said, "because forgetting would be the real sin." Margaret Bourke-White's legacy lived through every shutter click of those who followed her. She taught that a camera was not merely a tool, but a witness, a way to hold power accountable, to make people see what they wanted to ignore. Her fearless climb into bombers, her calm under fire, and her refusal to be sidelined by gender became a quiet revolution that opened the door for generations of women behind lenses. Today, when journalists cover conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, or Gaza, their courage carries echoes of these pioneers. Every image of a bombed-out street, every whispered report from a war-torn hospital, every story told in defiance of censorship, all trace their lineage to women like Gellhorn, Miller, and Bourke-White. They were not chasing glory, they were chasing truth. They showed that journalism is not about neutrality in the face of evil, it is about bearing witness, even when it costs you your peace. Modern correspondents cite them as guiding lights. Christiane Amanpour, Marie Colvin, Clarissa Ward, all have spoken of standing on the shoulders of those who came before, of women who faced the same doubts and dangers in an era that told them they didn't belong. When Marie Colvin was killed in Syria in 2012, her final report echoed Gellhorn's tone, raw, human, and unflinching. It was proof that their fire still burns. The world these women helped shape is far from perfect, but it is more honest because of them. Their legacy lies not only in what they reported but in what they made impossible to deny. Without their courage, the horrors of Dachau, the desperation of refugees, the dignity of soldiers, and the truth of victory's cost might have remained buried under propaganda and denial. Instead, they forced the world to look, and to remember. Their names may not always appear in textbooks, but their spirit endures wherever a journalist dares to ask uncomfortable questions, wherever a photographer raises a camera against oppression, wherever truth is valued above approval. They prove that war is not just fought with weapons, but with conscience. In a time when misinformation spreads faster than bullets, their example feels more vital than ever. The women who once had to fight for permission to write about war are now the patron saints of every truth seeker. They remind us that storytelling can be resistance, that empathy is its own form of bravery, and that the truest victory lies not in winning wars, but in ensuring the world never forgets them.